Layla Carter, dressed in simple yet comfortable attire, approached the check-in counter, her modest suitcase gliding silently behind her. Airports were a second home to her, familiar and unremarkable, having crisscrossed the country more times than she cared to count. But today felt different. A strange tension lingered in the air, one she couldn't quite identify. Beneath her lightweight jacket was a badge, a symbol of her position as a federal agent. But for now, she was just another traveler in the bustling sea of people. The terminal was alive with activity. Families shuffled quickly toward their gates, dragging reluctant children behind them. Business people, engrossed in their phones, darted through security lanes. Overhead announcements blended into a constant hum, adding to the chaotic symphony. Amid this familiar scene, Layla moved with steady composure, her purpose clear and her focus razor-sharp. This trip wasn't just another work assignment, it was critical, and every second mattered. As Layla reached the counter and handed over her ticket, she noticed a flicker of something in the attendant's expression. The woman's polite mask slipped just slightly as her gaze traveled from Layla's face to her understated outfit. Dark jeans, a plain jacket, sneakers. The look wasn't overt, but Layla recognized it immediately. It was subtle, yet unmistakable. A quiet assessment, a judgment passed in the blink of an eye. Years of experience had trained Layla to stay composed, but the pang of familiarity hit her all the same. She'd seen this look before, too many times to count. For people like her, it wasn't just about how she carried herself or what credentials she had. It was about perception, the unspoken expectation that someone in her position shouldn't look like her. These moments of implicit bias didn't always scream. They whispered, sliding under the radar of those who delivered them, but cutting deeply for those on the receiving end. The attendant's fingers hovered uncertainly over her keyboard. Layla noticed the quick glances, the eyes that darted back up to her face, then down again to her clothes, as if seeking an answer that wasn't there. Layla's neutral expression betrayed none of the discomfort stirring within her, but her instincts were sharp. The questions forming in the attendant's mind were almost audible. Is she in the right place? Is she supposed to be here? Can I see some ID, please? The attendant asked, her tone polite but tinged with an unmistakable doubt. Layla calmly reached into her jacket, retrieving her government-issued identification. She slid it across the counter without a word. This part of the process was routine, something she had done hundreds of times. Usually, it was over in seconds, no hassle. But not today. Today, the attendant's hand hesitated as she took the ID, her skepticism lingering like an unwanted guest. Layla stood silently, waiting. Yet, the moment dragged on, each passing second amplifying the tension. There was always a point where doubt tipped over into outright suspicion, and Layla could feel that tipping point approaching. The attendant frowned slightly as she examined the ID, her eyes narrowing as though trying to discern something hidden. Layla didn't flinch. She had learned long ago to remain still and composed, even as her patience was tested. She knew what this was about. It wasn't about the ticket, nor the ID. It was about perception, about how people filtered their assumptions through unconscious bias long before they even realized it. "Are you sure this is your flight?" the attendant asked, her cautious tone betraying her unease. She glanced at the first-class booking on the ticket as if it were a puzzle piece that didn't fit. "Yes," Layla replied evenly, her voice steady and calm. The frustration she felt beneath her exterior was carefully tucked away, invisible. "First class as booked." The attendant nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. Layla noticed the way her eyes flicked over her shoulder, a clear sign that she was considering calling someone else over. Layla stayed silent, observing, her composed demeanor unshaken. The seconds crawled by, and with each passing moment, Layla could feel the quiet microaggressions piling up like bricks in an invisible wall. The attendant avoided direct eye contact, her movements deliberately slow. Her hesitation wasn't neutral, it spoke volumes. Every gesture, every uncertain glance seemed to silently ask, "Should you really be here?" Layla's calm exterior remained unbroken, but she couldn't ignore the weight of the moment. This wasn't the first time she'd faced such treatment, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But today, of all days, she didn't have time for this. Her mission was urgent, and every minute spent here was a delay she couldn't afford. The attendant glanced back at the ID once more, her skepticism as clear as day. Layla's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but her voice remained steady. She had no intention of escalating the situation. She simply wanted to get through this unnecessary obstacle and move forward. But as she watched the attendant hesitate again, a familiar thought crossed her mind. This isn't about me. It never is. It's about what they think I should be. The unspoken doubts hung heavy in the air, but Layla stood her ground, poised and unshaken. She had been here before, and she knew she would face it again. As Layla Carter waited at the check-in counter, the attendant's demeanor became increasingly telling. Though her tone remained polite, her body language and hesitant glances toward Layla suggested something deeper, disbelief, maybe even suspicion. "Let me just check something," the attendant said, her fingers moving sluggishly over the keyboard, as though intentionally delaying the process. Layla, a federal investigator on a critical assignment, stood her ground. She had experienced moments like this before, moments that silently conveyed "Kurzbeweist." You don't belong here. No words needed to be said. The message was in the eyes, the tone, the unnecessary scrutiny. Even though she had grown used to this treatment over the years, it never became any easier. Each passing second was a reminder of the stakes. Layla's mission required her to be across the country in mere hours, and every delay added pressure she couldn't afford. The thought of pulling out her badge crossed her mind, a simple move that would end the scrutiny immediately. But she hesitated. Why should she have to? Why should her authority be doubted until she proved otherwise? The attendant's fingers paused on the keyboard. "I just need to verify some details," she said again, this time with a slight edge in her voice. Layla noticed the subtle shift, a defensiveness, perhaps. It wasn't about her ticket or her ID. Layla knew that much. It was about something far less tangible, but no less significant: her appearance. It didn't matter how many years she'd spent building her career, how many sacrifices she'd made, or how diligently she'd served. What mattered now, in this moment, was what the attendant thought she should look like. Layla could feel the doubt radiating from the woman's eyes as she stared at her simple outfit. Jeans, a casual jacket, nothing flashy or important looking. The line behind Layla was growing, and so was the impatience of the travelers waiting their turn. She could sense their unease, their sidelong glances as they tried to figure out what the holdup was. The murmurs and shuffling feet only added to the tension, but Layla's exterior remained calm, unflinching. "Is there a problem?" Layla asked, her voice steady but firm. She wasn't trying to escalate the situation, but she needed to move forward. Time was slipping away, and she couldn't afford to let this drag on. The attendant looked up briefly, her expression guarded. "No problem, just a routine check," she replied. But Layla had heard those words too many times in too many places. She recognized them for what they were, a way to justify singling her out. These so-called routine checks always seemed to happen to people like her, and each one felt heavier than the last. The seconds stretched on as the attendant continued typing, the doubt never leaving her eyes. Layla thought again about her badge, still tucked securely under her jacket. It would be so easy to pull it out and end this charade. But something stopped her. "I am more than my badge," she thought. "I shouldn't need to use it just to be treated fairly." Yet here she was, being reduced once again to how she looked on the surface. The frustration bubbled just beneath her composed exterior, but she refused to let it show. Years of experience had taught her to remain calm, even in moments like these. The line behind her shifted restlessly, and the subtle tension in the air grew heavier. She could feel the silent judgments forming in the minds of those around her. To them, it was likely a minor inconvenience, but to Layla, it was another exhausting reminder of the barriers she had to face daily. Finally, the attendant glanced nervously at Layla's ID again, and then turned to a colleague standing nearby. "Can you double-check this for me?" she asked, her voice lowered but still audible enough to signal that something about Layla required additional scrutiny. The colleague approached with the same air of skepticism. His eyes darted to Layla, then back to her ID, as if the very act of her standing there needed further investigation. He held the ID up to the light, his frown deepening. Layla remained still, her face unreadable, but inside, the frustration churned. She had done everything right. followed every procedure, provided every document. And yet it wasn't enough. It never seemed to be enough. The colleague's gaze shifted back to her, his expression betraying the same unspoken question the attendant had. Does she really belong here? Layla stood firm, refusing to let their doubt erode her confidence. But the weight of the situation pressed down on her, heavier with each passing moment. This wasn't just about a flight or a ticket. It was about something much bigger, the endless, unspoken battle against assumptions and bias. And Layla was tired of fighting it. But for now she waited, because that's what she always had to do. The colleague held her ID up to the light, turning it over as if he might uncover some hidden truth buried deep in the laminate. His brow furrowed, and then his gaze shifted back to her, scrutinizing her presence with a polite but sharp tone. Are you sure this is the right flight? He asked. Yes, I'm sure, Layla responded evenly, her voice calm and measured. She wasn't here to argue, but the way they were handling the situation made it clear she was being forced to prove herself. Again. Every word she spoke seemed to bounce off an invisible wall of skepticism. The colleague turned back to the attendant, and they exchanged a silent glance, the kind that spoke volumes without a single word. They weren't just verifying her ticket, they were deciding whether she belonged. Behind her, Layla could feel the impatience brewing among the travelers waiting in line. A low murmur began to ripple through the crowd, and then a man directly behind her let out an exaggerated sigh. What's the holdup? Is there a problem with her ticket? He said, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The murmurs grew louder. Layla's pulse quickened slightly, but outwardly she maintained her composure. She had been in this exact scenario too many times, and each time it felt like a fresh reminder that no matter how much she had achieved, how much she had sacrificed, it was never enough. Her presence was questioned first. Her accomplishments came second. She drew in a deep breath, holding on to her steady demeanor, but inside the tension was tightening like a coiled spring. The colleague continued flipping her ID back and forth, as though the answer to his doubt might somehow be hidden in the corners of the plastic. The attendant stood nearby, her eyes darting nervously to the line. Passengers were no longer just murmuring, they were openly watching now. Layla caught the sharp glances, the narrowed eyes of a woman a few spots back in line, who leaned toward her companion to whisper something. Both of them stared at Layla with thinly veiled annoyance. The colleague finally handed the ID back to the attendant, but neither of them moved to speed things along. Instead, they exchanged another glance, a silent conversation that only deepened Layla's growing frustration. This wasn't just a delay anymore. It was becoming a spectacle, and Layla could feel the weight of the stares pressing down on her. The unspoken judgments in their gazes were beginning to simmer into something more overt. Another sigh from the man behind her, sharper this time, pierced the air. I don't know what's going on, but this is ridiculous, he muttered, his tone pointed. Heat crept into Layla's chest, not because she had done anything wrong, but because of the assumptions being made around her. She could feel the humiliation beginning to rise, the kind that wasn't about guilt, but about the silent stories being written in the minds of the people watching. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a phone being raised, the lens aimed squarely at her. A slow dread settled in the pit of her stomach. She knew exactly how this would play out. A brief, contextless clip of her at the front of the line causing a delay, no explanations given. To those who watched it, she would be reduced to a headline. Woman holding everyone up. They wouldn't know her mission, her rank, her achievements. They would see only what they wanted to see. The attendant's voice broke the tension, though only slightly. We're just verifying some details. Please bear with us, she said, her tone clipped and no longer hiding her own frustration. She glanced nervously at the line, as though Layla herself were responsible for the growing impatience. The colleague stood by, his expression unreadable, but the doubt in his eyes still lingered. Simmering beneath the surface, Layla kept her stance steady, refusing to let the weight of the moment crush her, but the frustration was undeniable. This wasn't just a delay. It was another reminder of how quickly people assumed the worst. No matter her credentials, no matter her experience, she was still being reduced to what she looked like, a problem to be solved, an outlier to be questioned. The glances, the murmurs, the phones capturing every second, all of it added to the mounting tension. And yet, Layla remained composed, standing tall despite the storm swirling around her. It wasn't the first time. She knew it wouldn't be the last. But knowing didn't make it easier. Layla felt her grip on the situation slipping, not in a way that would make her lash out, but in the way each breath now required deliberate effort. Her heart wasn't racing from fear, but from the oppressive weight of the moment. This wasn't new. She had stood in similar situations before, but each instance seemed to cut just a little deeper than the last. Clenching her jaw slightly, she forced her voice to remain steady as she spoke again. "Is there something wrong with my ticket?" She already knew the answer. There was nothing wrong. But she needed to say something, anything, to remind them that she was still standing there, waiting. "No, no," the attendant replied quickly, her tone dismissive and now tinged with irritation, as though the very question was an inconvenience. "We're just making sure everything is in order." But her words didn't match the tension in her expression. Layla could see it clearly now. There was no real problem. There was only an assumption, an unspoken belief that something must be wrong because of who Layla was. The murmurs from the growing line of passengers behind her became more pronounced. Glances filled with impatience and annoyance were exchanged as the atmosphere shifted like a building wave, ready to crash at any moment. Another phone was raised, its lens pointed in her direction, capturing the scene from yet another angle. Layla could almost hear the narrative forming in the minds of the onlookers. A difficult passenger holding everyone up, causing a delay. But she wasn't causing a scene. She wasn't making trouble. She was simply standing there, waiting for them to do their job. And yet, her presence was enough to be viewed as the issue. The phones kept recording, and the murmurs grew louder. The man behind her, who had already voiced his impatience, spoke up again. "First class, huh? Must be some mistake," he said, his words dripping with sarcasm. A few people nearby chuckled, the sound hitting Layla like a sharp jab. Her frustration surged, but she fought the urge to turn around, to say something that would silence them. What good would it do? She had been in this position too many times. Every explanation felt like a loss. Every word spoken to defend herself was a reminder that she had to prove her right to exist in spaces where others simply moved freely. And for what? For being in line, just like everyone else. The attendant finally handed her ID back, but the tension between them remained thick, almost tangible. The doubt lingered in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Layla could feel her resolve starting to crack, not because she couldn't handle the situation, but because it never seemed to end. Every encounter like this added to a weight she had carried for years, and today it felt especially crushing. She could feel the eyes on her from every direction, the silent judgments forming in their minds and, in some cases, being whispered aloud. Still, she stood there, waiting for them to recognize who she was. Waiting for them to understand that she wasn't the problem. But the waiting, that was the hardest part. Because it wasn't just about today, it was about every time before this and every time still to come. And as Layla stood there, calm on the outside but boiling with frustration on the inside, she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over yet. When the supervisor stepped forward, her heart sank. She recognized the coldness in his expression and the sharp skepticism in his eyes before he even spoke. This wasn't a man coming to resolve a situation. This was someone who had already decided she was a problem. "Is there an issue?" Layla asked. Her voice still steady, still professional, though every part of her was bracing for the worst. "I'm going to need more verification," the supervisor said, his tone indifferent. Layla kept her expression neutral, but the weight of his words hit her like a blow. He didn't ask for clarification, didn't listen to her explanation. He simply waved a dismissive hand at the ID she had already provided. His posture, his tone, everything about him screamed that he wasn't interested in who she was or why she was there. "I'm a federal investigator," Layla said, maintaining her composure despite the rising frustration in her chest. "I need to board this flight. It's urgent, official business." But the supervisor barely acknowledged her words. His expression didn't change. To him, she was a nuisance, someone to be managed and dismissed. The phones multiplied, subtly raised at chest level, their lenses capturing every moment of the unfolding scene. Layla Carter could feel the weight of their stares, the silent judgments in their eyes, the assumptions being made that had nothing to do with the truth. Each passing second felt heavier than the last, the situation pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The air around her was thick with murmurs and whispered remarks that stung more sharply than outright insults. A woman in the crowd leaned toward her companion, speaking just loud enough for Layla to hear. "She's probably trying to get an upgrade or something. This is ridiculous." The words cut, but Layla kept her face impassive, refusing to give them the reaction they were looking for. Another voice joined in from farther back, dripping with disdain. "What's the holdup? It's not like she belongs in first class anyway." The comments started to blend together, a toxic symphony of baseless judgments. None of them knew her. They didn't know her rank, her authority, her years of service. All they saw was a black woman at the front of the line, delaying their flights. And in that moment, it felt as though the entire world had turned against her, reducing her to something she was not. Anger welled up inside her, burning hot and fierce, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't afford to lose her composure, not now, not here. The humiliation was inescapable. Every glance, every whispered comment, every phone pointed in her direction felt like an attack. It was as if she were being put on trial, judged by a crowd that had already made up its mind. The need to prove herself, to justify her very presence, was suffocating. Layla's eyes flicked toward the clock. Time was slipping through her fingers, precious time she couldn't afford to waste. She was supposed to be on that plane, en route to a mission that couldn't wait. Instead, she was trapped here, ensnared in a web of doubt and prejudice. She glanced at her watch, the seconds ticking by, with maddening slowness. Each wasted moment felt like a step further from her goal, and the frustration of it all swelled within her like a rising tide. The supervisor still stood in front of her, stiff and unyielding, his doubt as apparent as the scorn in the crowd's whispers. He didn't need to say it outright, his demeanor made it clear. He thought she didn't belong, not in this line, not in first class, not in this space. Layla wanted to scream, to shout, to demand that they see her, really see her for who she was. But that wasn't her. It wasn't who she'd fought to become. Her entire career had been built on maintaining composure, on holding her ground with quiet dignity, even in the face of relentless challenges. This moment was no different. And yet, the exhaustion of it all began to creep in, the constant burden of having to explain herself, to prove herself, to fight for respect that should have been granted without question. The crowd grew more restless, their impatience bleeding into sharper whispers. Someone muttered, "She's making a scene. Can't she just move along?" Another chimed in, "Maybe she's in the wrong line, trying to get something she doesn't deserve." The accusations hung heavy in the air, thick with condescension. Layla could feel her patience wearing thin. Her pulse quickened, her frustration coiling inside her like a spring ready to snap. She had been patient, she had been calm, but everyone had their limits, and she was dangerously close to hers. The supervisor hadn't moved, hadn't budged an inch. His doubt was immovable, his posture radiating the silent expectation that she would fail, that she would give him a reason to dismiss her entirely. Layla realized then that no explanation she offered would sway him. His mind was already made up, just like the murmuring crowd behind her. The phone stayed up, recording each excruciating second of her humiliation, every forced breath of her composure. What had started as a simple delay had transformed into a spectacle, a public display of doubt, disrespect, and assumptions. And at the center of it all was Layla, standing firm but battered by the weight of it all. This wasn't just about missing a flight anymore. It was about everything, her authority, her dignity, her right to exist without being questioned. And for all her strength, all her resilience, the moment left a mark that wouldn't soon fade. Layla Carter could feel the oppressive weight of every gaze fixed on her. The silent accusations, the unspoken judgments. It was no longer just a delay. It had become a battle she hadn't sought but was forced to fight. Every whispered remark and lingering glance seemed to press down on her shoulders, each one asking a question she didn't owe an answer to. Does she belong here? Finally, she reached her breaking point. Without a word, Layla reached into her jacket, her movements slow and deliberate. She was keenly aware of the eyes tracking her every move, the anticipation rippling through the crowd. What would she do next? Her fingers found the badge, cool and solid against her palm. For a brief moment, she hesitated. This wasn't supposed to be necessary. She shouldn't have to brandish her credentials just to demand the respect any traveler should be afforded. But she knew there was no other way to end this. She drew the badge out and held it up for the supervisor to see. The shiny metal caught the harsh airport lights, reflecting its undeniable authority. "This is who I am," she said, her voice calm yet laced with the frustration she'd kept bottled inside. "Now, are you going to let me board?" The crowd fell silent. The murmurs died away as every pair of eyes turned to the badge. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The badge bore Layla's name, her rank, her authority. Everything that she had worked tirelessly for, everything that these people had doubted. The supervisor froze, his expression flickering between disbelief and embarrassment. He stared at the badge, his mouth slightly open, as though every word he had prepared moments earlier no longer applied. Behind him, the check-in attendant stood rigid, her eyes darting between the badge and Layla's face, struggling to reconcile the two. All the hesitation, all the suspicion, all the subtle disrespect, it now seemed absurd in the glaring light of what was real. They had doubted her, judged her, scrutinized her. And all it had taken was a flash of that badge to unravel their carefully constructed assumptions. The change in the air was palpable. The passengers who had whispered and chuckled under their breath now fell silent. Their phones, once raised with eager anticipation, lowered slightly as the realization of what they had been capturing settled in. This wasn't a scandal or a spectacle. They hadn't recorded a difficult passenger causing a scene. They had filmed a woman of authority being questioned, humiliated, and made to prove herself for no reason other than her appearance. Embarrassment rippled through the crowd like a wave. The man who had sarcastically questioned her place in first class shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor as though he could will it to swallow him whole. Others exchanged awkward glances, avoiding Layla's gaze entirely. The truth was now undeniable, and it humbled them in a way words never could. Layla stood firm, her posture unchanged from moments before, but the calm she now projected was different. It wasn't forced composure or patience. It was the calm of certainty, of knowing her worth, and no longer having to prove it to anyone. The supervisor, still staring at the badge, seemed lost for words. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The noise of the bustling airport faded into the background. The gleaming metal of her badge carried a weight that shifted the entire dynamic of the encounter. Finally, the supervisor stammered, I apologize, ma'am. We didn't realize." The words felt hollow, and Layla knew they weren't born out of respect, but out of embarrassment. He waved a hand toward the attendant as if to expedite the process. But the damage had already been done. The attendant, who had been so quick to scrutinize and doubt, now fumbled nervously with Layla's documents. She avoided eye contact, her rigid posture betraying her discomfort. The judgment she had so easily doled out now seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. Around them, the crowd stood in awkward silence. The phones that had eagerly recorded Layla's supposed defiance were now clutched awkwardly in their owners' hands. The people behind the lenses were no longer so sure of themselves. Layla didn't care about their apologies, spoken or silent. She was done with the doubt, the prejudice, the endless need to prove herself. Inside, she was exhausted, not just from this moment, but from the countless moments like it that had come before. She took a steady breath, holding her ground as she waited for the next step. The story the crowd had built in their minds had unraveled before their eyes, and now they had to sit with the truth. Layla's calm and resolute presence filled the space where their doubt had once been. Her badge, held firmly in her hand, had said everything she needed to say. She didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. This wasn't a victory. It was simply an end to yet another unnecessary battle. But the weight of their assumptions, the ease with which they had judged her, lingered in the air. A stark reminder of how much work was still left to be done. Layla Carter had shown them exactly who she was, and the balance of power had shifted entirely in her favor. The tension, doubt, and suspicion that had filled the air only moments before had vanished, replaced by a heavy silence that hung over the room like a fog. The supervisor stood frozen, his eyes glued to the badge she still held in her hand. When he finally spoke, his words stumbled over themselves, thick with discomfort. I'm so sorry, ma'am," he began, his once confident demeanor now reduced to an awkward attempt at recovery. "We had no idea. We didn't realize." He trailed off, his apology hollow in the face of what had just transpired. Both of them knew the truth. Nothing he said could undo what had already been done. Layla didn't respond immediately. She let the moment settle, the weight of it pressing down on everyone present. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She hadn't come here to receive one. The damage was done, and no string of words could erase the humiliation or the unnecessary delay. The supervisor, desperate to rectify his mistake, scrambled to act. "Let me expedite your boarding," he offered, his voice a little too eager. "I'll make sure you're on the next available flight. No further delays, I promise." But it was too late. The crowd had seen everything, and so had she. Layla could feel the shift in the air, the shame thick and palpable among the passengers who had been so quick to judge. The supervisor's apology and his efforts to fix the situation felt empty. They weren't rooted in genuine respect, but in embarrassment. He hadn't recognized her authority or value until she had been forced to spell it out for him with a flash of her badge. It wasn't an understanding of his own bias that had shifted his attitude, it was the undeniable truth of her position. The people around her shifted uncomfortably. Those who had whispered snide remarks and cast judgment now avoided her gaze. The murmurs, once filled with sarcasm and impatience, had turned into hushed whispers of recognition. A woman near the back who had been recording the scene lowered her phone, her face red with discomfort. Another man cleared his throat and stepped back as if he could physically distance himself from the judgment he had so readily cast earlier. Layla remained still, her posture steady. She had already said everything she needed to with the simple act of showing her badge. There was nothing left to explain, nothing to justify. Her identity had been questioned, her authority doubted, and her presence scrutinized. And yet, with one undeniable symbol of who she was, all of that had shifted. But the shift didn't erase what had come before: the humiliation, the whispered doubts, and the subtle but cutting stares. As she stood there, Layla thought about how easily they had dismissed her before the badge came out. How quickly their doubt had seeped into every interaction, every glance, every delay. Their assumptions had been immediate and unrelenting. They had looked at her and seen someone who didn't belong, someone who didn't fit their narrow expectations of power or authority. And now, with the truth laid bare, they were scrambling to undo their misjudgments. But Layla didn't need their apologies. What she needed was to get on her flight and complete her mission. The rest of it, the embarrassment, the backpedaling, the awkward attempts to make amends, didn't matter. What mattered was how easily their assumptions had formed, how deeply rooted their biases were. Without the badge, without the undeniable proof of her authority, they would have continued to doubt her. That was the real problem. The crowd's judgment had reversed in an instant, but Layla found no satisfaction in it. She had no interest in their newfound respect, because it wasn't about who she was as a person. It was about her title and rank, the external validation they had needed to see her for what she already was. Without the badge, she would still be standing there, enduring their questions and their disbelief. That was the part that stunned the most. A few passengers tried to meet her eyes, as if silently offering apologies. But Layla didn't seek their approval. She wasn't interested in absolving their guilt or accepting their discomfort as penance. Her mission hadn't changed, and her focus remained on what truly mattered. Without another glance at the supervisor or the silent crowd, she stepped forward, leaving the awkward stares and whispered apologies behind her. They weren't important. As she passed the supervisor, Layla felt the weight of the crowd's gaze following her, but it was different now. They had seen the power shift. They had watched the truth unfold. Yet she knew it didn't undo what had led to this moment. The assumptions, the snap judgments, they were still there, buried under layers of societal bias. The only difference was that those biases had been laid bare for everyone to see. Layla's outward calm remained intact as she moved away, but the weight of the experience clung to her like an unwelcome shadow. No matter how many times she faced situations like this, no matter how often she proved herself, the assumptions always lingered. This moment was no different. It wasn't about her title, her rank, or even the badge. It was about something far deeper, something no badge could ever fix. The revelation had changed the dynamic, but the damage was already done. And as Layla continued forward, leaving the stunned silence behind her, she knew one thing with certainty. This moment, like so many others, would stay with her. It was a stark reminder of how quickly the world could judge, how easily it could dismiss. But it was also a testament to her strength, to her ability to stand firm in the face of it all. Badge or no badge, Layla had endured. When she finally boarded the plane and settled into her seat, exhaustion hit her like a tidal wave. Her mind raced, replaying the incident on a loop, but her body felt suddenly heavy, weighed down by the emotional toll of what had just unfolded. The steady hum of the cabin offered a momentary reprieve from the chaos she had left behind, but the memory of the encounter lingered. She had been in this exact emotional space before, worn down by the unrelenting need to justify her presence, even when everything she had achieved in her career should have been enough. As passengers began filing onto the plane, Layla noticed a few of them stealing glances in her direction. Their faces bore expressions of guilt and curiosity, as if they wanted to say something but knew they had no right. The earlier whispers and judgments felt distant now, buried beneath the realization that they had all been wrong. Layla felt the shift, but it brought her no comfort. Nothing about the situation had surprised her, and that was the saddest part of all. She took a deep breath, trying to release the tension still gripping her chest. It had never been about the badge. That little piece of metal only held power because the people around her needed it to see her for who she was. Without it, she would have been just another face in the crowd, dismissed because she didn't fit into their narrow view of what authority or importance looked like. That thought, the painful realization, stuck with her the most. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Layla turned her gaze to the window. Her faint reflection stared back at her against the darkening sky. Her thoughts drifted to others who had faced what she had just endured, people who didn't have a badge or a title to silence the doubt. How many had stood at counters like hers, bearing the weight of judgment and suspicion, with no recourse to push back? How many had been treated as less simply because of how they looked, where they came from, or how they were dressed? This wasn't just her story. It was the story of countless others who couldn't end the doubt with a single flash of authority. For them, the weight of these moments never lifted. Layla knew this fight wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been dismissed, questioned, or underestimated for no reason other than someone else's bias. The realization settled over her as the plane lifted into the air, the hum of the engines drowning out the noise of the cabin. Layla's resolve solidified. She had fought this battle before, and she knew she would face it again. But she also knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't just about enduring these moments. It was about changing them, for herself and for the countless others who deserved to be seen, heard, and respected without having to prove their worth. The fight wasn't over. For Layla, it was just beginning. It wasn't enough that she had survived this encounter. It wasn't enough that she had proven herself yet again in the face of unfounded doubt. The issue ran deeper than this single moment. It was systemic, embedded in the structures and assumptions that created situations like the one she had just endured. As Layla leaned back in her seat, she thought about her journey. She had worked her way up through the ranks, facing barriers at every turn. Yet she had persevered, carving out a position of influence, a platform that could reach those who held power. But now, sitting in her seat, the realization hit her. She couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about her or a momentary inconvenience. It wasn't about bruised pride or a personal grievance. It was a reflection of a larger, insidious problem, one that didn't only affect her but countless others who faced judgment and dismissal every day. Her mind raced with possibilities. There were conversations to start, policies to challenge, and systems to dismantle. Flashing her badge had resolved the situation this time, but it hadn't addressed the root of the problem. The badge had only shielded her from the worst of it. What about the next person? What about those who didn't have a badge, a title, or a position to command authority? The ones who couldn't pull rank to counter the tide of judgment? Layla thought of them, of the countless individuals who deserved a world where their worth wasn't questioned before they even had a chance to speak. They deserved better. She turned her gaze to the window, her reflection faint in the glass. But unlike before, her eyes were sharper now, more focused. She had been through moments like this too many times, each one chipping away at her patience, leaving behind frustration and exhaustion. This time was different. This time, she wasn't going to push the experience aside and simply move on. Yes, she had survived. But survival wasn't enough. Layla knew she had to do more to ensure others wouldn't have to endure what she had. This moment wasn't just a conclusion. It was a beginning, a stepping stone towards something bigger. Her thoughts circled back to the airport. The supervisor, the attendants, and the passengers who had so quickly turned on her before they knew the truth. Their judgments had come fast, their assumptions forming in an instant. And when the truth emerged, when her badge had exposed their error, they had recoiled in shame and discomfort. But that discomfort wasn't enough. It was fleeting, passing as quickly as it had arrived. It wouldn't lead to change unless it was channeled into something more meaningful. Layla understood that her responsibility now was to turn the shame of that moment into action, into a conversation that people couldn't ignore. As the plane leveled out, cruising smoothly above the clouds, she leaned back and let the weight of her resolve settle over her. She was tired, yes. But this wasn't the exhaustion of a single moment. It was the fatigue of a lifetime of proving herself over and over again. This time, though, she felt a different kind of determination. This wasn't the first time she had faced doubt and dismissal, and it wouldn't be the last. But from now on, Layla would ensure that every encounter carried meaning, that every moment of judgment became an opportunity to push for change. She had survived this time, and she had come out stronger, more determined than ever. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning, and this time, Layla Ellis was ready.